Good morning and welcome to the Cosmosphere in Hutchinson, Kansas. I'm Mimi Meredith.
I'm Shannon Whetzel.
And we are here to bring you coffee at the cause wherever you are, which apparently today is coast to coast. And that means from New York to Texas, because Shannon and I were just saying, because I love to be able to say people joined in from coast to coast. Texas, you have a coastline. So thank you for that.
You count.
We want to remind you that following that fabulous video that you saw as an introduction, you can make a journey from wherever you are to the Cosmosphere to see so many of the artifacts that were represented that detailed the critical prelude to the race to the moon. And few people understand that we have that abundant collection, the largest collection that is combined representation of the US space program and Soviet space program in the world. And Shannon, that always sounds like, oh, sure. But Shannon is our curator.
And I know, I'm here to testify, it's true.
It's the truth. So come see us this summer or anytime. And also, if you know anyone who is 18 or younger, who is interested in summer camp that has a STEM spin, remember the Cosmosphere. It's outstanding. We have programs that are designed specifically to meet the guidelines of the Boy Scouts of America. So Scout camps can be found under Merits of Space because they get merit badges up to 4 in every single Scout camp. We have Scouts for students ages 7 and up that are half-day camps. And I would say that there is an element in this year's camp that there hasn't ever been before because we have this exciting way to bring in career pathways. For instance, in some of our camps where they're learning to design a Mars habitat, they may have to learn how to set a broken bone or start an IV.
Oh my goodness.
I know.
That's pretty cool.
Camp gets serious this summer.
Yeah.
We're seriously going to expose kids to all kinds of career fields. even presenting television presentations, because we're at home going to want to know what's happening on Mars. So they're going to need to know how to set up video, how to create a news conference environment. It's so robust. You won't find anything else like it. And the deadline for scholarship applications is April 30th. So hop to it, folks. It's April 15th. That gives you 15 days to help someone get to Camp the Cosmosphere. Right now, I feel like we're in a telethon mode.
Yeah,
does my voice sound kind of like that to you? Sorry, I'm just excited about camp. And for those of you who are adults who always wanted to be an astronaut when you grew up, growing up, this is your opportunity. Yeah, we're working on it. We have a week that is dedicated to families and adults. So you'll find all of that at cosmocamps.org. As far as today goes, thank you to nearly 100 of you tuning in via Zoom and Facebook Live. We want to hear from you. We are monitoring the chat feature. So please, the minute you hear Shannon say something interesting, which is every time she speaks, and you have a question about it, just add it to the chat function or tune in right now. Let us know where you're from and why you're interested in space or interested in the Cosmosphere. We're here to create community. We're here to bring you information that you won't find anywhere else. That is because we have people like Shannon on our team. She is indeed a subject matter expert. And today she is bringing you one of my favorite stories, because we all think about America and our being first to the moon.
Yes.
But Yuri's story.
It's pretty incredible.
It is incredible. So you're in for a treat today. With no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon Whetzel. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Mimi. All righty. Well, let's get started. So today, this is in honor of Yuri's, what did we say here? 60-year?
Yes.
60-year anniversary of the first flight of the first human in space. So not just American or Russian, we're saying the first human, because that is a big deal. And we'll go ahead and get started. Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin was born March 9th, 1934. So he would have been 87 years old if he was still alive today. And you can see this is a picture of his boyhood home. He was born in the village of Kushino, which is about 100 miles west of Moscow. And in my tours, I always say, that sure doesn't sound like an American name, does it, to the children? And of course they say no. So just making a very specific point here that the Soviets were the first to get into space. The Americans were the first to get to the moon. So Yuri has a very harrowing tale as a young boy. His village was occupied by the Nazis during World War II. His family was actually thrown out of their house and forced to live in a crudely dug shelter in their backyard. His older siblings were sent to a labor camp in Poland, and his parents really honestly just assumed that they were dead. So to go through the war thinking that your children are dead is pretty, it's not a good tale. Fortunately, they did come back, although it was pointed out in the book I read that they came back and the children were grown. They were essentially adults when they got back. Nonetheless, very happy to see them. And through all this horrible things that were happening to him, it was also during the war, though, that he was exposed to aircraft. Planes would actually crash in the fields, and they would go and try to help the Soviet pilots. And here he is as a young man, his pre-cosmonaut training and career. So after he left school, he went to Moscow to work at a steel plant as an apprentice. I have a really good quote, I think, from the foreman at that plant who said, "Was he special? No, but he was hardworking, which was equally as important." He was allowed to continue his training at a technical school, building tractors. And it was at this point that he was exposed to an aero club and did anything he could to be a part of it. Eventually, because of his enthusiasm and because of his time spent there, he was allowed to go to pilot school. And it was at this point that he began his military career, because you had to be a military cadet to be a pilot. It was also at this time that he met his future wife. and he made his first solo flight in March of 1957. Keep in mind, Sputnik happened in October of 1957, so just a couple months before. After this point in his life, he was sent to an Air Force base north of the Arctic Circle, which, and every time I hear a story about the Soviets or the Russians, it just seems like everything was so much harder and so much more difficult. I'm not going to go to an Air Force base in the Arctic Circle. It was extremely dangerous flying, even on a good day. He became a skilled pilot, although not getting as many flight hours as you would think for the experience level you would need to be an astronaut or a cosmonaut. And that was something that he grappled with later, which we'll talk about. But at this point, secret recruitments were happening at Air Force bases all over the Soviet Union, and he was part of that recruitment. So leaving Yuri for just a little bit, I didn't mention, but this is, we're going to take the format of a compare and contrast. The first Soviet in space and the first American in space. Focusing more on Yuri, though, because not only do I find that story really interesting, but also because of his anniversary. So the first American in space was Alan Shepard. He was born in 1923 in New Hampshire. His father was a retired lieutenant colonel, and I think probably the best description of Alan Shepard's life would be privileged, definitely. He lived a privileged life, but he was very driven too. He did not just sit back and wait for things to happen. He had an extremely high IQ too, although his grades didn't always reflect it. So he went through the primary school and all of that, and onto the U.S. Naval Academy. And that is where he took an interest in starting that career of flying and going into the Navy. And that was his boyhood home, I'm sorry. So Alan Shepard, here he is. I think I was supposed to keep going. There we go. Pre-selection. So before he was selected, he attended the Naval Academy, like I said. And as I mentioned, he was very intelligent. He skipped a couple of grades in grade school. And he was exposed to flying. And I think that he would work at the field in order. His payments would be he'd get to go up and fly every now and then with someone. And his dad really wanted him to pursue the Army during World War II, but he decided to pursue the Navy. We'll come back to his story in a second. So this is a picture of the cosmonauts during the selection. So a group of pilots was summoned. As I mentioned, they were doing secret recruitments, and then a group of pilots was summoned, about 20 or so. And then the numbers slowly began to dwindle, and eventually all of these pilots were being interviewed alone. So part of your selection into the Cosmonaut Corps, which is very similar to what we'll talk about the American side, it's very similar to that as well. They were sent to a military hospital in Moscow for health checks. Yuri recalled that he had 7 separate eye exams. They were extremely concerned about his eyesight, probably all of them, not just him. They did interviews with psychologists, and the heart is what he remembered was the main object of the exams. There was a lot of concern about how healthy their hearts were. They also did, this was the one that cracked me up the most, the crazy math tests where you would have to perform math problems with headphones on while someone is whispering the wrong answer in your headphones. So, yeah. I wonder how they did on that. I don't think I'd do very well. Math is not my forte, but nonetheless. So eventually, of these 20 candidates, 6 were chosen, and you can see here they are all lined up. This is a great photo. I'm standing where Yuri is. There's Yuri right there. And so the selection for the Americans was somewhat similar. I don't think I've stressed enough, I know this is early, but I don't think I've stressed enough the secrecy of the Soviet Union versus the openness of American society. So all of that selection process that Yuri Gagarin went through was very secret. The astronaut selection process in America was much different. The Space Task Force group initially wanted scientists, engineers, PhDs, and it was Eisenhower who stepped in and said that it should be military jet pilots, preferably test pilots, because they were used to cramped conditions, weird different things that could go wrong, making split-second decisions in aircraft that hasn't been tested beyond, so it's safe. So Ike stepped in and wanted military test pilots. The Department of Defense provided NASA with records of 508 military pilots. It was eventually narrowed down to 110, narrowed down to 69, and then 32 moved on to that pre-selection testing that was similar to the Soviets. So their testing occurred at Lovelace Clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Eventually, and they did similar things to, just the weird math tests, the psychological exams. I'm sure every orifice was tested or whatever, however you want to take that. So 18 candidates were delivered to the Space Task Group for consideration. So out of 18, they picked 7. The formal selection was in April of 1959. April 2nd of 1959, and then the press conference introducing them was about a week later, April 9th, 1959. So here we are, we've been selected to be astronauts or cosmonauts, and as I often mention, I don't really have a space history background, I have a history background. So one of the things that's always struck me about the space program is how they had some inkling of how to move forward, but they were really making it up from scratch. So how do you train someone who's about to do something that no human has ever done before? I don't know. That's left up to smarter people than me. So Yuri's training, he was 26 years old. As I mentioned, he was one of the 20. It happened in Star City, which is northeast of Moscow. And the first group, American and Soviet side, they really were true heroes, because a lot of the training they went through, afterwards, the scientists realized, well, that training wasn't necessary and we don't have to do that anymore. So they really went through some stuff that I think that the next generation of astronauts and cosmonauts was very grateful they didn't have to do. For instance, they were sealed in an isolation chamber alone. Scientists would change the air pressure as they wanted. There was no rhyme or reason to it. And then they would have to perform math, intelligence tests, physical exercise. You would be in there from 1 to 10 days, and you didn't know how long. I'm telling you right then, I would have quit the cosmonauts. They would go on the centrifuge, which is something we're familiar with on the American side. They also had an oxygen starvation experiment where you were again sealed in an isolation chamber while your air supply was slowly pumped out. This was kind of the medical staff led this side. And then the space engineers really kind of thought that was silly because you had your spacesuit. So if your cabin lost pressure, you would switch to your spacesuit and that would keep you alive. And if both lost pressure, you were dead, so it didn't matter. But nonetheless, they deferred to the medical staff on this one. The quote I got was, in space, you either have air to breathe or you don't. There's no need to test this. And then they did stuff that's more familiar to us, like parachuting. They did, of course, spacecraft familiarization classes, exams. The Soviets really struggled on their side with weightlessness. There was no practical way to train for weightlessness that the Soviets had come up with. They had more or less an elevator at Moscow State University that you could, that they would go down the shaft really fast, but it wasn't, and I think the Americans, they didn't have as much training as they would have liked either. They did theirs in cargo planes, but at least they had more time with that weightlessness. So up until Yuri's flight, and you'll notice it in the transcripts that you read, he's always saying, doing weightlessness, I'm doing fine. You know, I've achieved this and I'm fine, I'm okay. Because they really were worried about that at the time. And again, being the first person in space, I mean, are his eyeballs going to pop out of his head? We don't know. We honestly do not know. He even practiced, I'm probably getting ahead of myself like I do every time at my coffee programs, but he even practiced eating in space so they could make sure that for longer missions, people could eat. Because again, if there's no gravity and you're weightless, is your food just going to come up out of your mouth? They didn't know. I mean, these seem silly today, but they didn't know. Sorry, I got off. So he was chosen for his skills, obviously. He made it that far for his skills. But his short frame really helped in the selection process of who would be first in space. So the final selection was made on the eve of the flight. I think I read he was 5'2". So he was pretty small, and that's what they were looking for. And similar to what the Soviets were doing, that's another interesting thing. Here's my other tangent. Here we go, Michelle, just stand back. Stand back. Another interesting thing is, and I know that America was a very open society, so the Soviets could look to what America was doing and kind of make their own decisions, but how similar the training was and how similar the cosmonauts and the astronauts were. So just, you know, we're all people. That's what we say. Here's our lesson. Here's our life lesson. We're all people. Anyway, sorry. So Shepard's training, as you can see, their training began, I mean, they were picked, what did I say, April 2nd. They were introduced April 9th. Their training, April 27th. And similar to what the cosmonauts were doing, it was physical and educational. This picture is great. This is from their survival training. They were dumped in the desert somewhere, I think, Nevada, I think. I don't remember where. Yeah. They were dumped into the desert and forced to survive. You can see they have their parachutes on their heads. They had to train entering, exiting the spacecraft. Of course, they had to train the spacecraft systems. And then they did their weightlessness training in a cargo plane. And G-force was also, of course, obviously something they were training for. So I would say also a difference here in the Soviet and the American side is that the American astronauts were allowed to take a much more active role in their training, the spacecraft development. The Soviets didn't really ask the cosmonauts' opinions on most things. This is your spacecraft. Technically, you're not even going to pilot it. It's automatic. You're just there to tell us what's going on. And the Americans really did take more of an active role. And I don't know if that's a reflection on our cultures or if the astronauts were just louder and more vocal about it. Probably both. So this is Vostok 1. First, I'd like to point out that they didn't call it Vostok 1 because they didn't want anyone to know that it was the first of several. So they just called it Vostok. Vostok means east. The quote I love about this time in history is that the Vostok epitomizes the glory days of Soviet space exploration. And I think that's fairly accurate. It had 2 modules. So what you're looking at is the re-entry capsule. And then there was also an instrument module attached to it until the end of the flight. It was roughly 8 feet in diameter. It was covered in an ablative material. So this is the difference between the American spacecraft, which we'll talk about next, but the Soviet spacecraft, you can see it's covered in that ablative material. And it, for lack of a better term, it was weighted. So it would right itself as it entered the atmosphere automatically. It had 3 small viewing ports. It had an ejection seat, which is important later. If I don't bring it up here, I'll bring it up again. It had TV and film cameras, obviously. It had a radio system, control panels, life support. It weighed approximately 10,000 pounds, and it launched on April 12, 1961. Vostok 1. There were several, and I think there were 7, 8 Vostok. I'd have to go down into our gallery. I know, quit looking at you, I know. Valentina was 6, I know that. And someone launched right before. So anyway, Vostok 1. The cosmonauts could scan the dials and relay the numbers to ground control. They decided what the readings meant down on Earth. So again, as I mentioned, the cosmonaut was, I don't like to take away from what they did because I think this was a huge accomplishment. They didn't do suborbital flights like the Americans. Our first two flights were suborbital, meaning they went up and they came back down. They were about 15 minutes. Yuri's first flight, the first manned flight ever, orbited the Earth. So I don't want to take away from that. That was an extremely important thing. But he did not have much control over the spacecraft. And each orbit was 90 minutes. So I think if you include the launch and all of that, his whole flight was 108 minutes total. One of the reasons, there was an argument over whether or not they should control the spacecraft. Some of the engineers thought it would be fine, but a little bit of Soviet paranoia sneaks in there because they were worried, of course, first that the astronaut would go mad in this spacecraft up in space, which, I mean, there was some concern here about that too, but also there was another concern that the cosmonaut would defect to the west and land somewhere else and I guess never be seen again. I mean, I don't know. So there was some concern over their defection to the west. So there was no, for this Vostok 1 flight, there was no NASA countdown. The Soviets said that was just something Americans do to make their flights look more important. So 9 minutes after leaving the pad, he was in orbit. And again, I think we talked a little bit in the beginning about the secrecy of the mission. He was not allowed to tell his family. He was allowed to tell his wife. He told a little white lie and told her that the flight would actually happen on April 14th or something. She had just had I think it was their second child. And so she had a 3-week-old baby and was busy, and I'm sure he didn't want to worry her. He'd also told his mother he was going on a business trip and just said it was very far away. So there is some controversy over his flight, which I'll just go ahead and get into now, about the, about the ejection. The Soviets intended to claim the world aviation altitude record. And this record had rules that were established by the international community. So technically the pilot had to remain inside his vehicle all the way to touchdown. And at this point, the Soviets were not sure a person could survive landing in the Vostok. Now later they figured all of that out. But as they were reading these rules and realized that we don't think our pilot will survive, they already had the ejection seat designed and figured it was easier to lie than redesign the Vostok. So Yuri didn't stay in the craft the entire time. He ejected out. And then there was a parachute attached to his seat and he floated safely down to the Earth. But so the site where he landed is very well known. The landing site for the Vostok is it's known, but it's not as publicized because that was part of the secret. Since they supposedly landed together, there wouldn't be two separate sites. It was roughly 3 miles, I think, from where he landed. And school children found the Vostok spacecraft and started pulling out space food. And others came looking for souvenirs, obviously. This is a very exciting thing. And so the hatch door and survival gear and all of that was disappeared. And the KGB actually came to that area and requested that the items be returned. So, oops. But that's the Soviet spacecraft. So let's look at the American spacecraft. This is the Mercury spacecraft. It is Alan Shepard's was Freedom 7. And it was developed by McDonnell Aircraft Corporation. 11 contractors bid on it and McDonnell won out. As you can see, it's a different shape. It's a truncated cone. It had a small pressurized cockpit, which let me get out of the way here. There we go. They would climb into that tiny little hole. It did have an escape tower. And as I mentioned, the astronaut did land with the spacecraft. And we talked about the ablative material that would get the spacecraft through the Earth's atmosphere. Well, so the Vostok was covered in it, and the Freedom 7 just had that, the heat shield at the bottom to get in. So it takes more than one to get into space. It takes a whole team. So what was the Soviet team like? Well, we have to start first by talking about Sergei Korolev, who was the chief designer. Again, we talk about the secrecy of this time. His name wasn't known. He was just known as the chief designer, which is really cool, except I think it got in the way of his career a lot, but it is pretty cool to be known as the chief designer and nothing else, if you like an air of mystery. So he designed and built the rocket that sent the first satellite into space. So that's Sputnik. The rocket that sent the first animal, the first man, the first woman, the first two-man crew, etc. So he was a very brilliant scientist. He spent about 7 years in the Gulag prior to this time. It was actually one of his colleagues who turned him in, and then they had to work together later on at the, just another hiccup in the Soviet system that in the beginning wasn't as obvious, but showed up later on. His identity was secret until his death, and it was such a secret that I read this little anecdote about how when Yuri was being honored in the Red Square, Korolev wasn't allowed to be a part of the, the limos and the train and all of that brought him in. He had to come up with his own ride to get there. And then the vehicle broke down on the way there, and he had to find another ride. And he wasn't allowed to wear any of his medals. He wasn't allowed to be recognized in any way. Oh yeah, and so the rest of the team, obviously there were more people. So the rest of the team, one of their biggest fears, as I mentioned earlier, was worried about giving control to the cosmonaut of the spacecraft. They didn't allow the cosmonauts to give any input or help design it. And I think a big barrier they faced was their lack of a network of allies for communication. And their allies were not in the right places anyway. America had allies all over, and you could call on people at different stations to monitor the American spacecraft. And actually, that very basic communication system is still, it's been modified and it's better, but it's basically what they use today. So unfortunately, in the Soviet Union, though, once the spacecraft disappeared over the farthest horizon, it was out of communication. So they had to equip 4 cargo ships with special radios and send them out into the ocean. And then everything had to be coded because these messages would be easily intercepted. So just another barrier that they faced when trying to communicate with Yuri and future cosmonauts. And even the man who was supposed to pick Yuri up, part of the General Stechenko was his name. And he was telephoned from the Kremlin hours before saying, by the way, someone's going to fall from the sky and you need to get there and get him. And if he's not safely recovered, you'll pay with your head. So better get there. And he immediately divided up his area into quadrants. That's, of course, if everything went okay. They also, well, we'll talk about that in publicity, but they had some issues too when trying to make that altitude record, make it stick. Would his landing have been different? Anyway, so another thing that the Soviet team did for the cosmonauts was the night before the flight, they put strain gauges in the mattresses to see who tossed and turned the night before the flight. So between Yuri and Gagarin and Titov, to see who, in theory, got a more restful sleep. Now, of course, the cosmonauts figured this out. And so Yuri often said that he got less sleep because he was so worried about moving. He just laid there. So another part of the secrecy, I think, was that he did have some issues in his flight with the module, and then his spacecraft. The wires didn't cut the way they should have, and he started to tumble. And fortunately, when he entered the atmosphere, the wires burned up, and then he was able to the craft righted itself, and he landed fine. But these issues he was not allowed to speak about candidly, so he had to be very careful when he came back. He spoke candidly once in a private post-flight meeting with the engineers and the Soviet team, and then after that. And the funny thing is his problem wasn't fixed by the second flight. So I don't know if they thought it was just some sort of anomaly that wasn't going to happen again, but Titov experienced the same problem. So they were unsure of where he would land. They didn't want him to crash through a roof and kill someone, obviously. But Stuchenko was able to locate him before he even hit the ground. So all of that went well. And I think that before we move on to the American side, I think that one of the things we've discussed about this is that the Soviet team was often at odds with each other. They worked together, but then also they jockeyed for position a little bit. So I think that is one thing that hampered their space, on top of many other things. But when you're constantly worried about watching your back, it's difficult to move forward. Put that on a throw pillow. On the American team. So I premised it with that because on the American team, there really was a lot more camaraderie. They were competitive, definitely, but they were working for one purpose. They were trying to get an American into space. So the team included contractors, the engineers, mission control on the ground, the trainers, obviously the astronauts themselves, all working towards this one goal. And as I mentioned also, if you think about the American team as this network of allies, where you could have stations there was one in Mexico, I'm trying to blank. There were stations all over the world that would help monitor the spacecraft. So they were in almost constant communication. So let's talk a little bit about the publicity, because as we mentioned, the secrecy versus the openness of American society, the post-flight publicity was very different. I love this photo. I don't know why. I just love it. So as I mentioned, they had some issues with that world aviation altitude record. So they sent out envelopes to the news outlets, all controlled, obviously. And so they would know, and they would tell the news outlet which envelope to open after they knew the results of the flight. And of course, they had a press statement ready in case he died. But so if he landed in quote unquote enemy territory and they knew that he did in fact eject out of the spacecraft, there was no point in trying to claim that record. If all went well, as far as anyone was concerned, the pilot remained within the spacecraft the entire time. And then, of course, the one about his death. So they had it all ready for whatever happened. The first autograph Yuri signed was right before he got into the spacecraft. And some of the sources I read, which this is probably true, I mean, you don't know what's in his head, but it was probably the first time it really hit him how incredibly famous he was going to be, and the way this would take over his life. You're so busy training and thinking about, how am I not going to die while I do this? It doesn't necessarily occur to you that you're going to be so famous. So some of the team who was helping him, he signed some autographs then. Immediately following the flight, the press was all over his family. They were climbing in open windows of the house. It was immediate, wanting details because there were so few details about this new young cosmonaut. And then America actually knew of this impending launch. Kennedy, in fact, asked not to be awakened because of the time difference. I think the successful launch or the successful recovery and all of that was announced at 5:30 a.m. US DC time. So the flight happened in the middle of the night. So Kennedy said, just don't wake me up. I'll find out soon enough anyway. So here's a quote that Yuri wrote. This is from his official account of the flight, the public version. That I caught sight of a woman and a little girl standing near a dappled calf and looking curiously at me. I was still in my bright orange spacesuit and they were a bit frightened by its strangeness. I'm a friend, comrades, I shouted, taking off my helmet and feeling a slight shiver of nervousness. She said, can it be that you have come from outer space? And he said, as a matter of fact, I have. Obviously, that's the official account. But I think the slight shiver of nervousness, this was right after the U-2 spy plane had crashed into Soviet territory. So there was I'm a friend, comrades. I'm a friend. I'm not an American crashing into this area. So, but I thought the can it be that you come from outer space? And as a matter of fact, that's very cute. After Yuri was recovered and taken to the airfield where he was going to be, taken to Moscow after that, the fences of that airfield were buckling under the weight of the onlookers. And I think, again, that moment is at a point where he realized, my gosh, I mean, this is all for me. Can you imagine you're just leaving work and like there's people trying to take down a fence to get to you? There was a celebratory event in Moscow, as I mentioned. His family was waiting for him. We didn't really talk about this yet, but another reason he was picked was his proletarian background. So coming from farmers, and that just fit that whole communist Soviet persona that they were going for. So his parents were not allowed to dress up. They were purposefully told to look like peasants. It's a shame. I think the book I read, his mom wanted a new dress, but you need to look like a peasant while you to keep up that image. So another thing I think that, and I don't know how much you can train for this or prepare for it, but Yuri was a very careful interview. Like he was careful never to mention that issue he had on reentry. Always very careful to make sure that it was the Soviets, the Soviet cause, the communists. This is why this all happened. We're technologically superior. He became a huge ally for Khrushchev, and Khrushchev returned the favor. So after he gets back, he goes on a tour of the Eastern Bloc countries. He goes to England, which I think I have a picture that I like. Yeah, you guys just get to look at pictures I like. Here he is meeting the Queen. Oh, let me go this way. So Canada, Cuba, as we saw in the other picture, and then after some rest, the tour continued to India, Egypt, Afghanistan, Greece, Japan. A quote from his publicity tour, which I think really, really kind of explains how he felt. I think he said this to his driver or someone in his personal entourage. He said, "Everyone is writing about me, and it makes me uncomfortable because they are making me out to be some kind of superhero. In fact, like everyone else, I've made mistakes. I have weaknesses. They shouldn't idealize people. It's embarrassing to be made to seem like such a good, sweet little boy. It's enough to make one sick." So I'm sure, and it played so well to Khrushchev and the Soviets for him to have this dashing smile and be this very smooth talker and give these really great interviews. But I think that also he was a genuine person. Like when he met the Queen, he mentioned to her, I don't know which fork to use. And she said, I've lived here, all my life. I don't know which fork to use either. So just that down home, I mean, I don't think that you can fake that, or you have to be very good to fake that. So unfortunately, fortunately for Khrushchev, his charm and ability to speak was fantastic. However, it also made him a lot of enemies at home. The quote I found in the book, which I love, superiors rarely forgive you for outdoing them. And, I don't have it on here, but to reiterate that, the BBC News, while they're during one of the newscasts, I found a quote that was, Moscow has never sent a finer ambassador. So he was just, even though the differences between the countries, he was warmly received. Great for Khrushchev, not so great to anyone else. So, and unfortunately, not so great for Yuri's career after Khrushchev was forced out of power. And not only not great for his career in that aspect, but when you're traveling like this, you don't have time to train. So he was unable to keep up his flight hours. He didn't get to do much training in any of the new or modified spacecraft. So wanting to go back into space just because of his career path and his choices, and that's what he wanted, he really didn't get that opportunity. And actually, he never flew in space again, which we'll talk about more later. And Shepard post-flight publicity, his splashdown and recovery were televised and watched by millions. There's probably some of you watching this right now who could say, I remember the flight of Alan Shepard. I watched it. So once he was back, much like Yuri, there were parades. He met the president, obviously, as you can see. This is a great photo. Let me see the photo away. He met the president. He was an instant celebrity, and that continued on into his career. And just to move on, this is a great photo too. So just to move on to his post-flight publicity, and then even talking a little bit about the legacy that followed that. So he became extremely famous. He did a suborbital flight, and then John Glenn did the first orbital flight. He also became extremely famous too. But that's a good photo. So what was it about? How did this affect his legacy? How did being number 2 affect the American space program too? So obviously, the Soviets being first in space was a huge blow to the American psyche. I mean, we had been preparing, we were gonna do it. And then at the last second, there were some issues. I think it was with the rocket. And they want to be careful, obviously, which I think that, to me, absolutely, if I'm going to fly in space, I need to make sure the rocket's good. But the astronauts who were so competitive and so ready to go to space were not so enthusiastic. They're, no, let us go, let us go. So unfortunately, there was a chance that Alan Shepard could have been first. Granted, it would have still been suborbital, but it would have been first. It was embarrassing. We considered ourselves to be superior to the Soviets. If you think about World War II, America was, I don't want to say not affected, but like the homeland, the actual physical American homeland, the war wasn't fought there. Our economy was red hot coming out of it. I mean, so the Soviets had been, at war all that time. The battles were fought on their land. So to see a country devastated by war, and then in, what would that be, 15 years later, they're the technological geniuses sending people into space. So it was a huge embarrassment. And then America felt like it had to play catch up. And that's when the intensity increased. And Kennedy made his famous challenge that we would be to the moon by the end of the decade in 1961. I think it was it between flights? It was right after Shepard's flight, I think, that he made that announcement. So here we are, just barely having a presence in space, and now we're going to go to the moon. And I have read some accounts that Khrushchev knew that the Soviet Union, with its economy and all the other issues that were not as public, that he knew that the Soviet Union would not be able to keep up. So that's why you have those quick, exciting things happening. The first satellite goes in, then I think a month later, the first dog or the first live creature is in space, and then making sure that they get the first man in space, and then the first woman in space and the first spacewalk and all of those things, just trying to get those very quickly, knowing that they wouldn't be able to compete. Of course, I can't say if that's true or not, but it is an interesting way of looking at it. So yeah, America a little bruised, but we're gonna be all right. And then Yuri Gagarin's legacy, he was the first human of space exploration, and that's a huge technological leap. Especially, I don't want to take away from that. The Soviet Union was devastated by World War II. It was, Gagarin's village was occupied, so they were destroyed by World War II, and to come back from that is a big deal. So not only is he the face of human space exploration, he also became an ambassador for the Soviet Union, a symbol that the Soviet Union was confident, successful, technologically superior, really a facade that they were keeping up at that time. My favorite thing that I've read about him is that if you think about the Soviet era, so think about it for a moment, what heroes are from that time? So when I think of the Soviet era, I think of Stalin, and those are the only individuals that really pop up for a number of reasons, but for one of the reasons is that no individual was supposed to be greater than the collective whole as the essence of communism. But except one, Yuri Gagarin, he was the exception. Here is a hero out of the Soviet Union, an individual who everybody knew his name. So what a great story. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I think we're going to take some questions. There are none. I'm going to say that's because I did so well.
We have questions.
Oh, well, let's pretend we don't and say it's because I did so well.
All right, I can just read some off.
Okay.
Here. Give me just a second.
Okay, and I will try to remember to repeat them. That's one thing.
Yes.
That's my critique on my performances. Is this a performance? I don't know, my program.
Let's see. When the Russians launched Valentina Tereshkova into space as the first female cosmonaut, what was NASA's reaction to it, and why did it take them until the 1980s to launch a female astronaut into space?
That's a really good question. So if you didn't hear, it was about Valentina Tereshkova, who was at Vostok 6, so she came a little bit later. And the question, I'm sorry, Michelle, was what was NASA's reaction, and why did it take so long for them to launch?
Why did it take until the 1980s to launch a female astronaut?
Why did it take until the 1980s? Okay, I would guess that NASA's reaction is we're still trying to get our program off the ground. So and if you read a little bit about Valentina's flight, truly amazing, awesome, but the Soviet Union wasn't doing it to move women's rights forward or equality or any of that. It was kind of a stunt. But yeah, so I would say that NASA's reaction was that we're still trying to play catch up. I can't say why it took them so long, because it would have been almost 20 years later that they sent her into space, or Sally Ride. And the Soviets had already sent another woman. There were 2 Soviet women in space before Sally Ride. So Come on, man, we're better than that.
Next one is from Adam Hill. He's here from Hutchinson and he is
Woo!
in Sterling College. My students are learning this week about the early history of the USSR, and some may be joining us today for an extra credit opportunity.
Oh, awesome. Get the extra credit, man.
I know there was a great deal of secrecy around the Cosmonaut program, but I'm curious about how much the Soviet government publicized the goal of human spaceflight before Gagarin's flight. How much, if anything, was revealed in advance about the program?
I don't know how official, oh, I'm sorry. So let me repeat that. So how much did the Soviets publicize the goal of getting a human in space prior to the flight? And I would say that it was obvious that that was their goal. The American government knew it, hence why we're trying to get Alan Shepard up so quickly. And I think once they were, they got the satellites up, they've got the Laika, the dog in space, it was well known that that was the next goal.
And what is the name of the book that you read?
What is the name of the book? Oh, Starman. I usually bring it with me too. It's got an orange cover. Is that something I can give you later?
Yes.
Okay. So the question was, what was the name of the book? It was fantastic. It was one of the first times that the archives were kind of becoming more open, as well as they did a lot of interviews with people. They interviewed the guy. So when he first landed, it was a woman and her granddaughter who found him, but the man who kind of interacted with him more, they interviewed him. They interviewed his driver. It's an older book. Man, okay. I'll give that to Michelle and she'll post it. Oh, I think Kelsey might have a question.
Somebody said you're right. It is called Starman.
Starman, thank you. What did we do before the internet?
Next question. How did the Cosmosphere manage to obtain so many Soviet space capsules?
We received our Russian collections. It was, again, I think the true story of the Cosmosphere, again, and it's hard work, it's dedication, it's all of those things. But I also think we kind of had a really cool opportunity, right place, right time. So we received our Soviet and Russian artifacts in 2 major batches. One was a traveling exhibit that more or less got stopped in the US for lack of funding, and we were able to pick it up that way. And then the second round came working with someone who had contacts in the Soviet Union. And so all of those pieces were purchased. It was back in the day when we purchased a lot more of our collection. So yeah, and they're awesome. And a lot of them are the real deal. So you should come check them out. I believe Kelsey has a question, or someone.
This is from John Mayer. Did the cosmonauts have faith in the Soviet space program, or did they expect they would probably die?
Did the cosmonauts have faith in the Soviet space program, or did they think they were going to die? I think it's hard to know, especially on the Soviet side. That's a good question. It's hard to know because, as I said, the quotes I give you are from Yuri's official account, which was approved before it was published, I'm sure. I would think that, I don't know, young, brash pilots, similar to the American side, they're ready to go. And they did do a lot of training. I think that one of the biases, if that's a word, I came in when I started this research was, you think the Soviets, like, oh, they don't care about their cosmonauts. But they do. They absolutely do. Of course they do. They don't want anything to happen to them. So I think that they did a large amount of training and preparation, and so combined with that really just drive to be the first to go to space, I would think that they were fairly as confident as you can be doing something for the first time ever. Yes.
Okay, hold on.
I'm sorry, Michelle. Yes.
Sorry, I just lost it. Does the artifact, starting over, does the Cosmosphere have any artifacts from China's space program or SpaceX launches?
Does the Cosmosphere have any artifacts from China's space program or SpaceX? China, no. I think we have a few things from the European Space Agency, but not China's space or India's. We don't really have anything from them. And then, sorry, what was the second part?
Or SpaceX.
SpaceX. No, we have Spaceship One. What's that from? That's not SpaceX. No, I don't think we have anything from SpaceX, but we would love the opportunity. We always say that one area that we would love to build our collection is private space flight. So, and then we have some models and some smaller things, but no, nothing substantial.
I don't think you answered this one yet or asked this one yet. When did NASA and the Soviet space program first communicate with one another, exchanging knowledge and experience?
When did NASA and the Soviet space program first communicate with each other and exchange knowledge and experience? There was inklings from Kennedy that, wow, this space program is going to be really expensive. We should work together. And I think that Khrushchev was a little open to it too. Of course, there would have to be lots of public posturing and all of that, but behind the scenes there had been, I think there's a famous letter even that discusses that. And then Kennedy died and Khrushchev was forced out of power. And so, I mean, and I think that probably the astronauts and the cosmonauts probably always had an interest in each other. I mean, who wouldn't? Wouldn't you, if you're like, there's only 4 of us who've ever been into space, boy, I'd like to exchange, my experience, my story with someone else who's actually done it. So I think that probably they wanted to work together. The official time that the Soviets and the US first worked together was the Apollo-Soyuz test project, 1974, I think. So 1974 would be the official, and of course years before they start training together and all of that. So the 70s, let's say the 70s. I'm comfortable with that. Finally.
Looks like Spaceship One is from Virgin Galactic
Oh.
and sorry, X-Prize.
All right. So we do have a simulator from Spaceship One. And the little, not like it looks like coveralls from it. And they're on display. So you can check those out too.
I'm looking, I think. Sorry. I think that's it.
That's all you got, Kelsey?
Nope.
All right, fantastic. Well, again, we thank you so much for joining us. And Michelle, is there anything else you would like me to add, or?
That was it. If there is not a question that didn't get answered, we will answer it in the chat.
Okay. Oh, yes. So if there's a question
If we
that
miss one.
didn't get answered, we'll answer it in the chat. And we got that book, so we're good to go. Well, of course, I know that you think that this is a wonderful program, or at least I hope you do. I think it's a wonderful program, but it doesn't compare to the real thing. So I encourage you, if you haven't been here, to come by. We're maintaining all of our safe protocol, of course, and I just hope you enjoyed it. So thanks for being here.